To study the history of Kenya Airways, we have to study the history of East African Airways. And when East African Airways broke into three, each country adopted its own airline, and Kenya Airways has very little to talk about. So you'll find that I have essentially talked about the history of East African Airways. In 1943, the four governors of East Africa met and decided to have an airline. The four governors were the governor for Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Zanzibar. They wanted to start an airways which was to cover the region. But mostly, you know, we have these airways that have subsidiaries. Like East Africa Airways had a subsidiary which dealt with the local area in the East Africa. It was called Simba Air. Kenya Airways has a local which is called Jambo Jet. So the initial East African Airways was to act as the local airplane for the local company for BOAC in the region, so that anybody coming from London would board a BOAC. BOAC meant British Overseas Air Company. So the British, they wanted, upon reaching East Africa, then we have an airway that covers East Africa, and it can even go as further south as South Africa, and as further west as West Africa, and as further north as Egypt. So they wanted to start an East Africa, and it was a conference of governors. Just like in Kenya today, we have committee of governors. So that one was started was discussed in 1943, and then some BOAC, British Overseas Air Company, gave out some airplanes to this new company called East African Airways on 1st January 1946. When it gave out the planes, there was a problem with the coloring. You see, at the tail end, there is usually the color, the national flag of the company that is running. We had four. But you see, soon after independence, Zanzibar joined Tanganyika. Zanzibar and Tanganyika became one country, so that you can find that the planes had three flags. And we had each country having shares. The initial shares for the East Africa Airways was owned by East African Transport Authority. East African Air Transport Authority were the owners of East African Airways. And this is how they had shares. Kenya had 67% shares. Uganda had 22% shares. Tanganyika had 9% shares. Zanzibar had 1% share. So when Tanganyika and Zanzibar joined together, Tanzania had 10 shares. You'll find that is a round off. So the first airport they had was at Isili. Yes, where we have the Kenya Airways. No, where we have the Kenya Air Force. That was the first airport. And that airport was placed there on 1st January 1946. Of course, they later moved to Embakasi. We are going to remember that. But when they moved to Embakasi, and then they built a new airport adjacent to Embakasi called Jomo Kenyatta Airport, they again surrendered the Embakasi to the Kenya Air Force. So we had airports at Isili. We had airports at Entebbe and at Dar es Salaam. But for some reasons, the Nairobi airport was considered the superior, and this brought tension between the other countries. It brought about tension, and those were the first cracks of the East African Airways. The other cracks which came was that Uganda had Obote and Tanzania had Nyerere. Obote and Nyerere were ideologically bedfellows. So you find that they were not comfortable with the dominance of Kenya. Later on, Obote was overthrown, and as you may have noticed from East African community, it broke down because of the differences between Nyerere and Idi Amin, while in Kenya, for some reasons that are only God knows, Njonjo never wanted the East African community. So we were having that, and because of the tension that was happening, the countries were not, the independent East African countries were not contributing towards financing the company. So you'll find that during those days, BOAC, British Overseas Air Corporation, was paying for everything. You are wondering about British Overseas Airways Corporation? Today, it is called British Airways. So it reached a place, again, in the 60s, that Pan-Am, you know, there is an airplane, an air company called Pan-Am, meaning Pan America. Pan America wanted to have, you know, East African Airways had dominance in the region. And East Africa was holding the dominance on behalf of BOAC. BOAC today is called British Airways. So British Airways did not want competitors to come within East Africa. But the Kenya government entered into an agreement with Pan-Am, Pan American Airways, where Pan American Airways was to build for Kenya a hotel, an international hotel, in exchange of being granted landing rights at Embakasi. These landing rights were extended by the Kenya government to the Pan-Am, and where Pan-Am constructed Intercontinental Hotel for the Kenya government, so that they be given the right. This thing annoyed Tanzania and Uganda. So those things, and then there was the problem. You know, most of the pilots, I grew up with Saad. Saad was a Pakistan national. His father was a pilot with East African Airways. We were staying at Kericho Road, Upper Adams. You see, most of the pilots of East Africa Airways were Indians and Pakistans and whatever. So when Amin chased away Indians, you see, it affected the it affected the East African Airways. Another thing that Amin contributed, you see, even though the people who were employed by East African Airways and East African community were people who were loyal to Obote, but again, they were competent. So Amin went and sacked them, so that the airport, the East African Airways was wobbling. It had experts from Kenya, it had experts from Tanzania, but Uganda, it had none. So with that, it brought a lot of problems. Then, on 15th February 1977, East Africa Airways collapsed. And this is how it collapsed. There were planes which were having the East African Airways colors, which were in Dar es Salaam airport. The Tanzanian government grabbed them, painted the Air Tanzania colors, and decided that Air Tanzania had started off official. A fortnight later, Kenya, I remember they had their office not far from Hilton Hotel. Kenya now grabbed all the planes that were belonging to East African Airways and painted them as Kenya Airways. But later, after international mediation, it was decided, you know, every plane has a number plate. Kenyan planes are all called 5Y, then 3 alphabets. So you find, like, supposing I buy a plane, I'll apply, because I'm James LANDO KHWATENGE, I can apply for 5YJLK. But if there is anybody with 5YJLK, I'll be asked to look for another word, and then I may opt to apply for 5YJKL or KJL, such a thing. So that is how. So it was decided that we don't have number plates for a region. So it was decided that all aeroplanes that were registered in Tanzania, although having colors of East Africa Airways, would be given to Air Tanzania. Same to Kenya, same to Uganda. And you know, airways are given names. I think this last point is also very, very important. Why is it that Kenya Airways is called KQ? And you find other countries where aeroplanes like British Airways is called BA. You go to the airport, you hear flight number BA, this and this, prepare to board. Why is it that Kenya Airways, instead of people calling it KA, blah blah route number this, why is it called KQ? The reason is simple. While Kenya was part of East Africa Airways, Korea had already applied for the name KA. So they were given KA. And Kenya Airways, when it came to being on 15th February 1977, it found KA had already been taken. So they had to take any other number. And the only other number they chose was KQ. And that, viewers, is the history. Now, the history from that towards Kenya Airways, you know, and that is how East Africa Airways started on 1st January 1946 and ended on 15th February 1977. From 1977, 15 February to date, it is Kenya Airways, Air Uganda, and Air Tanzania. But the history of Kenya Airways is so little that I just feel I should say how it started. Thank you.